First of all, I would like to make my thanks. This is one of the best organized conferences I've been to, and I know that this is thanks to the inimitable Paul Prinsloo, because I've been to conferences he's organized before, and his team. Thank you very much, Paul, for your generosity, your meticulousness, and your extreme consideration throughout this process. I know that I'm speaking for all the keynotes when I thank you for that. Also to your wonderful team, Manoko, who's taken such good care of us, and your fabulous student assistants. Brian, who helped in the workshop the other day, who's probably running around helping now, and the whole team. They really are great. Thank you also to Oxford University Press, who sponsored my being here. I think it's appropriate, given my background in publishing. I'm still very committed to publishing and all its activities, and we are very mindful how much it's changing at the moment. So thanks for that. So the title of my talk is Being Parties in the Work. And it's a view of the changing landscape. And I thank Gronya for laying out so much of the terrain yesterday, a whole lot of things I now don't need to do, as people have the background. The title of my talk comes from John Henry Newman, The Idea of the University. Because we're at a point now when we're thinking about universities where we really are rethinking what a university is. And it's wonderful. You can read John Henry Newman's work online, open access. It's all out of copyright, and I had a good time a couple of weekends ago rereading what he had to say, and I was particularly interested to see what he had to say about technology. And he said, a university is, according to the usual designation, an alma mater, a loving mother, knowing her children one by one, not a foundry or a mint or a treadmill. The best telescope does not dispense with eyes. The printing press or the lecture room will assist us greatly, but we must be true to ourselves. We must be parties in the work. So my talk today is about how we can be parties in the work, because I think that still holds true. So I'm going to be talking first of all about the nature of new technologies, what their characteristics are and how they're changing the landscape. Then I'm going to take even a further step back and look at the global terrain and the changing nature of the players in the global terrain, their interests and their values, and particularly from the point of view of the South, as was mentioned earlier. And then I'm going to talk about what this means for access, participation, and learning. Briefly, obviously, all one can do in this kind of talk is an overview. I can only have one slide about higher education under pressure. There's so much to be said, but I think everyone in this room is aware of the fact that higher education is under pressure. It's the subject of conversations at tea time, and I'm just going to mention one or two particularly important aspects. The first of which is the financial crisis, which doesn't only face us here in South Africa, but faces universities and governments who fund higher education globally. And I think quite a lot of what's happening in this space is because of that financial crisis, where decision makers and purse string holders are hoping that new technologies can solve some educational challenges. Then we have the issue of massification globally, and we have South Africa's gross enrollment rate, which is actually relatively low. And we have the situation in South Africa where we have what is called by Ian Scott a low participation, high attrition system. So we have not enough students coming into the system and 40% of them leaving higher education in the first year. That's pretty scary. And we have, given our particularly South African situation, another scary reality, which is that only 5% of African youth succeed in higher education. This is a contextual framing consideration that seeds into all discussions about higher education. And in this context, we have technology, which is pervasive. It's a cause of much of the change in higher education. And as I mentioned, it's seen as a solution, hopefully by many. And it also mediates all practices. There are assumptions that it's increasingly ubiquitous. So for the first part, I'm going to talk about what are the affordances, what is the nature of these technologies that are offering opportunities now that were not the case even a decade ago. And I'm going to use a fantastic writer called Lev Manovich, who's in the new media literature, in the new media space, who as long ago as 2001 was characterizing the nature of new technologies. And I think as I run through these characteristics, people will recognize immediately how they are being taken up in the education space. He wasn't writing about education. So the first thing is numerical representation, so that new media exists as data. And of course, this is particularly relevant in the online learning space with the promises of learning analytics and big data, with its pluses and its minuses. Then he characterizes new media by modularity, and I'm going to be talking more about this because this is particularly relevant to those of us who are involved in curriculum design. So different elements of new media exist independently. He talks about automation. This is prescient, I think. New media objects can be created and modified automatically. And once again, in the online space, in terms of, for example, assessment and feedback, the promise of automating those kinds of activities is pertinent to us. He talks about variability. So new media objects exist in multiple versions, which is a challenge for those who curate content, because it's very difficult to know, such as publishers. I see some nodding in the front row. How do you know which is the final version, which is the authoritative version? And does it matter? In many ways, that provides many opportunities, but it's also very difficult when things are so easily changeable. And finally, and probably the most interesting in many ways, is what he calls transcoding, which is that the logic of the computer influences how we understand and represent ourselves. And I think that particularly in the MOOC space, Gronjo, that's the first time I've said MOOC, the logic of what new MOOC platforms are able to do and how they create platforms and environments is particularly relevant here. Just to add a couple of more digital affordances that pertain particularly to content. It's granular, it's dynamic, and particularly important in the online space, communication becomes visible. This is quite different from a seminar room. An online chat is visible, and that communication is a form of content, which adds layers to what content is. Sharing in the online space is free and easy. This is a profound difference, and how it is interpreted and taken up varies depending on one's interests. But sharing means multiplying, not dividing. So in the analog space, either one person has the object or the other person has the object if you share it. In the online space, if you share a file, everyone has the object. And of course, this has a lot of implications to digital content and how it's shared, which I'll say more about. And finally, although I'm working in the open scholarship space, one must also be mindful that the digital also closes down as much as it opens up. It's not automatic. These affordances can be used for opening up and for closing down. So I'm going to talk a little bit about modularity, this disaggregation of teaching and learning, which is so pertinent to learning designers and curriculum developers. And what this refers to is the way that content, teaching and learning interactions and certification can be and are being separated. So we know what traditional learning looks like in a university. We have a campus, we have a timetable, we have a book list, textbook list, we have exams and graduation, and we have great teachers. These are the distinguished teachers, two of the distinguished teachers from my university this year. And when you are a student in a university, you sign on and you get the whole package. That's the deal. In a disaggregated environment, those elements become separated out. So the content space changes a great deal. If one thinks of access to learning content on a matrix. In the analog space, we have textbooks and we have some photocopying. There are legal, I think it's 10% you're allowed to photocopy, so there's some legal photocopying. There's also a lot of illegal photocopying that goes on. Those are the practices with content. In the digital space, we're seeing the rise of e-textbooks and e-books and open education resources. And of course, in the digital illegal space, there is use of pirate sites for books as well as music and films. Maybe academics don't know that, but students certainly do, as we know from our research. And of course, there's a great deal of file sharing. So all of these are going on at the same time because we're in a transition between the analog to the digital. Much more complicated than it used to be. And digital content is a particularly interesting one in terms of the shift from products to services. So when you buy a book, or when your university buys a book, it buys the product. But when you buy an e-book, you actually buy the rights to use that file. And that right can be taken away from you. My favorite example is the day that Amazon withdrew 1984. 1984, that book, that particular book, from everyone's Kindle who had bought it because they discovered they were in copyright violation. It was just something about it being 1984. So the control is no longer with the customer. You have the belief that it's on your machine and therefore it's yours. In fact, you've paid for the right to use it. And that's a big shift from ownership to license. And another complicating factor is that there can be an intermediary of a platform. So as I was saying, with the analog, you get the content and the packaging in one object, the book. In the digital space, you get access through a platform. And the services might be through an intermediary, and you might have to buy access to that platform as well. So this is not necessarily an opening up in many contexts. And I think if people think of their own context, you can see that this might add a layer of difficulty. At the same time, we're seeing the rise of open content, which is legally open content that is either free to, which is either gratis or libre, which means that you can simply download it, or you can download it and remix it, depending on the license that's been made available. And open content either has an open license, a Creative Commons or another type of license, or it's in the public domain. And for those of you who are not in this area of work, the important thing is that open content grants permissions, not copyright. So in fact, in the traditional publishing space, you give away your copyright. In the open content space, you keep your copyright, but you articulate the permissions for use. So it's a different model. And at the same time, in the university, and in fact in general in society, we are dealing with, in a number of ways, a whole range of discourses about piracy. So those illegal practices that I referred to earlier. And those discourses about piracy, as you can see from the examples that I've provided here, are of the most nasty and malevolent type. They don't actually engage with the changing nature of the practices. They are termed in terms of theft, whereas in fact theft is similar to what I was saying earlier. If you steal something, the person you take it from doesn't have it anymore, so it's actually not analogous to theft. It's a different kind of activity. And I mean, this is not the purpose of the talk today, but the discourse on piracy, I think, actually interferes with a more useful discussion about file sharing and the changing nature of copyright. So that's a whistle-stop overview of content. As for the teaching and learning space, the whole terrain here, the course provision space, is changing too. That's teaching and learning in a traditional residential university as we know it. Increasingly, I should have had a pointer. Increasingly in both the residential and the distance learning space, we are seeing blended models, ranging from internet supported through to internet dependent, right into online intensive. And we find that both in distance universities and in traditional face-to-face universities. That's been going on for quite a while. It's not really new. How, the kinds of centers for teaching and learning and technology have been supporting those kinds of activities. It hasn't really changed the nature of the landscape profoundly. But what is changing the nature of the landscape is the increase in fully online courses, both in the traditional residential space and in the distance space. And it also is bringing together a convergence in terms of what the different types of providers do and who they're competing with. I'm very mindful that I'm standing here at UNISA, which must be going through some serious reflections about its role in an environment where traditional universities are interested in providing online courses and where the policy environment is no doubt thinking about who is able to provide online courses. And I think we will be seeing a different policy environment in the next 5 years. That's my guess. And once again, mention of MOOCs. The MOOC hysteria of the last 18 months. We could talk about MOOCs all on their own, but I just want to say two things about MOOCs that I think are pertinent to this discussion. And I think the first thing is that MOOCs have legitimized online learning at elite residential universities. So those universities took no notice of online learning before MOOCs. And they conflated online learning and online courses with distance education. And when MOOCs came along and the Harvards and the MITs of this world were involved with them, throughout the world, vice chancellors called on their teaching and technology people and said, what is this? What should we be doing? Should we be joining in? Is there a bandwagon that we ought to be on? So what it's done is it's drawn attention to online education in a quite dramatic way. And this is an opportunity for those of us who are interested in the opportunities of online education. But the other thing it's done is it's introduced new policies and new possibilities for business models. And I'll say a little bit about that because I think that the possibilities for new business models are of interest and concern to us as educators. Just to go back to the disaggregation thread, place is being replaced by platform. And we are seeing a very complex landscape of platforms. The platform providers are obviously jockeying for position. I don't think it's a coincidence that Blackboard, I believe, has recently been acquired by Microsoft. I'm not sure, don't quote me on that, but I wouldn't be surprised. So the platform environment is critical because it's the way in to, it's the new learning environment. It's replacing place. And you can make analogies with what goes on in learning spaces in a physical environment with what goes on in learning spaces in a platform environment. We even get situations where you pay for access to the platform in order to get free Creative Commons open content, as I was explaining earlier. And finally, in terms of laying out the modularized form of things, certification is now also becoming something separate from that overall package that you get. And we're seeing increasingly the use of badges. Now, I think the first time people heard about badges, they looked askance and said, this sounds like the Scouts movement. I think we've actually moved on. Badges are being taken more and more seriously. And for those of you who are not familiar with badges, they are a kind of micro, once again this word granular, certification, which gives some sort of recognition for small chunks, once again the word chunks, of activity, of learning activity. So people can develop and create portfolios and they can get badges along the way for certain of their activities. It's at the moment tends to be more competency-based. And we're also seeing the rise of private assessment. So private assessment centers that are not being run by universities but by private providers. And of course the thinking is that you could do a MOOC, and if we get to the point now where certification is offered, you would go to a private assessment center who would oversee the processes for those, for the certification. So to go back to Manovich, we can see the modularity in the disaggregated teaching and learning activities, the numerical representation, automated assessment, versions of content, and changing ways of how we see ourselves. A modularized, variable, transcoded teaching and learning landscape. Does this sound like technological determinism? I hope it doesn't. Certainly, I am not of the view that technology is neutral and that is simply up to us as educators to use technology. If I was going to take a theoretical stance, it would probably be an actor-network approach, a sort of socio-material landscape. The technology has affordances. And of course, who engages with them, who designs them, and how they are used is absolutely relevant. But certain kinds of practices and activities simply were not possible before, and now they are. So it's not meant to sound determinist at all. In fact, the choice of my heading was to actually remind us not to allow this to be the case, but rather to engage with it. So the second part of what I'm going to be talking about is the broader global higher education landscape, the increased involvement of the private sector, with new opportunities for the private sector, with new players, and with how this is all playing out in the globalization agenda. We know that the internet is distributed. It's one of the most important aspects about the internet. This is a representation of all the nodes of the internet. And that central set of nodes could be switched off and the internet will still function. It is the most important feature of the technological environment, and it's also one that's being highly contested at the moment as certain governments are trying to take control of that technological distribution. And it's meant that we have a network society with all its promises and perils. So Castells, who's one of my favorite writers, was really the one who coined the term of the network environment and who pointed out the ways that functions and processes in the information age are organized around networks. And he's the one who noted that the social morphology of our society and the diffusion of networking logic is around processes of production, experiences of power and culture. And I'm going to come back to this point about power. Castells has an optimistic view. He's visited South Africa a few times, and he's an incredibly optimistic person about what this might mean for what Narendra Vaishnav yesterday called the social justice agenda. And he said that in the past, social networks were more limited and networks were more exclusive, and that the internet makes it possible for inclusivity and increased participation. And really, given the changing environment at the moment, the question is, to what extent is that the case? Are we changing those networks, those core networks, and making network relationships that work for our interests? Because while this is all going on, we are seeing an increased marketization discourse in higher education, and there's so many examples of this. This term, edupreneurs, I mean, what an extraordinary bringing together of an education concept and an entrepreneur concept. When ivory towers fall, the emerging education marketplace. So this is not the bringing together, this is the replacing of. And we're seeing massive increased private sector investment. This is an example of venture capital, and of course venture capital goes where it sees the opportunity for making lots of money. Venture capital investment in educational technology companies, and if you just look at the rise from 2007 to 2011 in number of deals and the sum of equity invested, it's huge. To go back to my earlier point about online education becoming an acceptable space for educators and educator decision makers to be playing in and thinking about. At the moment, online education is in the hands of the private sector. So in the US, John Daniels points out, the for-profit sector has a much higher proportion of the total online market, 32%, than its share of the overall education market. And 7 of the 10 US institutions with the highest online enrollments are for-profits. And he adds, for-profits seem better placed to expand online because they don't have to worry about resistance from academic staff, nor about exploiting their earlier investment in campus facilities. I mean, this is very interesting because it gives you a different way of doing things without all the bother of people like us in this room asking too many difficult questions. I found this table recently of describing all the players who are now in the higher education space. Now, obviously, this is also about education and research. And these two writers are geographers, so they're interested in geographical reach and range of the regional frames, as they call it. And it's very interesting to see the range of players now, ranging from international organizations, information systems organizations, and I'm going to come back to that, the tech companies who are playing a role in higher education in ways they certainly didn't before, other than to provide our email, private for-profit education firms, as I've mentioned, MOOC platforms, IP law firms. The changing nature of intellectual property is an absolutely critical aspect which most of us simply blank out on the minute somebody mentions, and we really can't afford to. Private financial services firms, private foundations, as well as university consortia. It's a much more complex environment in terms of who all the players are. Just having a look at who the financiers are of Coursera, Udacity, edX, and Khan shows how varied those financial interests are and who they are and what they stand for. So it ranges from venture capitalists to the non-profit sector, grant-giving funders, to universities themselves, to companies and to individuals. A real sense of jockeying and maneuvering in the space, all around these new kinds of provision. So in summary, new players, for profit. Let us not forget that Coursera is a fully for-profit organization. And non-profit, so edX is not for profit. And while we're sitting and doing our daily work, it doesn't seem to make a difference. It does make a difference. The drivers to produce investment and profits for your shareholders is a very different driver from the driver to produce, to cover your costs, to further invest in your company. It's not the same model. We're seeing new roles for old players, such as educational publishers as providers of services. Many educational publishers have changed what they say they do. Their actual description of their core business has changed. And we're seeing old players with new value. So the distance education providers who were often regarded as second class, it's almost like it's turned on its head. We suddenly have a great deal to learn from distance education providers because they certainly know a great deal more about online education than those of us working in traditional residential universities do. Here's just one example, which I think is of great interest, is of Google, who has teamed up with edX to build a YouTube. And it's interesting to consider how, as this article points out, Google is collecting ways of engaging with education through Google Play for Education, Google Apps, its own course building platform. And I think that the last line is particularly telling. Whatever happens, Google will be there to lend a hand and share a piece of the pie. Because if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. This goes back to this question of data. Because although these apps are free, Google has got an extraordinary amount of data. And at the moment, that data is this contested area around personal data. Google will have, through these apps, data about student behavior. I mean, the implications of that are really worth spending some time considering. Google becomes a player we can't actually ignore. And I'm always interested in Google's statement, do no evil. And I wonder if they still have that statement as their mantra. Pearson is one of the most interesting players in terms of reconceptualizing who they are and how they work. And those of us who work in open education resources and who have really struggled with helping people find open education resources, well, Pearson's done a fantastic job of providing a search engine for open education resources, which you can access through their platform. Interesting reconceptualization with publishing services and search engine findability becoming such a critical consideration in an age of abundance rather than scarcity. We're also seeing interesting alliances. Here we have the State Department of the United States partnering with Coursera, offering the US embassies and the US embassy spaces for people who wish to have some physical space to work with other people doing online courses. And I note that this is not an altruistic activity. What does it say? Every participant on a MOOC camp will meet an advisor from the Education USA program. Obviously, opportunities for new markets and new students for the States. So this looking for markets, when I said at the beginning, the financial crisis Well, for many of our colleagues and colleague universities, I mean, not individuals, obviously, and governments elsewhere, we are the solution to their problems. And as long as we get increased connectivity, we become a more viable solution. So the British Council's report on the shape of things to come is absolutely explicit about online education, and particularly targets particular countries. And it's spoken about in a completely commercial way. So 61% of UK education exports in 2011 were higher education, and the intention is to increase that. And of course, what we have to ask is, what does that mean for us as providers locally? And if these kinds of online courses become really excellent courses, are we going to lose our students to these course providers? What does that actually mean? This is a representation of Coursera's global reach. So 3.5 million of 5 million IP addresses, so they didn't manage to get all the students. And it really shows you how extensive those Coursera courses are in terms of where they're reaching. With the edX in particular is spending a lot of attention on translating Coursera courses, and here's one example of Arabic translations of Coursera courses in Jordan. As I was saying earlier, these new models offer new ways of monetizing courses. So in the traditional model, you pay your fee, you have an entrance requirement, and everything else is pretty much paid for. You might have to buy a book, but you certainly don't have to pay to graduate. In the new model, the monetization option changes from you don't have to pay for access or for entry, but you might well have to pay for the book. And this has been explicitly stated by some of the providers that this would be a way of making money. You might have to pay for support, and you would have to pay for some kind of certification. Which leaves us with the question, what does this mean for the coherence of teaching and learning? Here's one example. It's an interesting South African example. A company which is offering and advertising free business education to the world. And when you watch the video, you pay for services to submit and have your assignments marked. You're paid to actually attend the physical classes, and you pay to write exams. So the notion of what this free education is and what that word education is up for reinterpretation. And of course, a lot of this we know is driven by costs. This is a graph from an Open University presentation which sums up an 8-year analysis of the relative costs of distance learning. And the production costs, which is what usually frightens people, are really relatively quite small compared to the massive ongoing costs of student support. And you can't really see this very clearly, but this is somebody who is trying to map out how the cost models are being rethought. And this goes back to Czerniewicz again. If you can have scalable and automated feedback and automated certification, it's a lower cost. And it's in stark contrast to the personalized feedback and support cost of the current model. And just to go back to my point about student data, one of the things that Coursera is actually offering is student data to companies who are looking for the right kinds of students. So I think it's clear that we have some serious values, tensions of values in the ecosystem. We've got private sector imperatives. We've got this rethinking of the role of higher education, public good, knowledge. Reading Newman again, he's absolutely clear that the purpose of the university is knowledge, circulation, the intellectual endeavor, preparation for the workplace, and of course, the learning and pedagogy needs that we're all so familiar with. And we have to ask at every point, who has control of which bit and when? And what is the role of technology in all of this? And we also have to ask, how is this playing out in the geopolitics more generally? Which brings me to the last third of my talk. And it's really about access and participation. Just forgive me a little pause for Bourdieu. I'm sure all of you are familiar with his forms of capital, and a reminder that forms of capital are forms of power. We're talking about economic capital, social capital, embodied cultural capital, objectified cultural capital, institutional cultural capital, symbolic cultural capital. And to start with, I'm just going to talk a little bit about economic capital and objectified cultural capital, which is the object, these technologies, which there is an assumption everyone now has or will have. And of course, globally, this is still extremely uneven, even as basic as electricity, as this map of the world shows so magnificently. There's nothing like a picture to make a point. But it's also interesting to look at undersea cables and see the way and the extent to which the global north is connected to the global north, and the global south is less connected to the global south, if not at all, and certainly far less connected to the global north. So yes, connectivity is increasing, but it's uneven. Households with or without internet in developed countries, it's almost 80%. It's just about a quarter in developing countries. And we know that there are massive differences in speed and in terms of the education levels of who actually has that connectivity. Rural-urban divides, and that's not only in South Africa, that's in the United States as well, as the White House reports show so clearly, and in terms of who income. Yes, in South Africa, mobiles do provide a more level playing field. This is from the advertisers, the AARP site, where they surveyed in terms of by living standards, which is an interesting way of getting a sense of access. And you can see that through all the different living standards groups, there is much more equivalence of connectivity by phones, but it's much, much more expensive. So that on the far right, percentage of gross national income, it's quite startling. The cost per capita, if you look in Africa, compared to everywhere else in the world. So mobile broadband, which is the promise at the moment, is hugely expensive, but it's still cheaper than fixed broadband. So it's a little bit more complicated than it looks at first. What about expertise, competence, qualifications, all those things? That's the business we're all in. Here I have to go back to this notion of access, which people, of course, talk about so often when they talk about the offers of access of online education. And I go back to a very South African interpretation of access, which is equity of access and fair chance of success. And that's not the way that access is being used in these other environments. If anybody's ever watched that first Daphne Collier Coursera video where she announced the first MOOCs, and she made this offer to solve education problems throughout the world, and she used the University of Johannesburg as her example. And she said it was a terrible thing that had happened when a mother had died, and Coursera was going to provide a fantastic solution. was quite a shocking thing to do. And yet, surveys actually show us, massive surveys. Here's one of 40,000 students in 500,000 courses, that while all types of students in the study suffered decrements in performance in online courses, some struggled more than others to adapt. Males, younger students, black students, and students with lower grade point averages. So these are the very students we are wanting to assist. And it is of interest to me that one of the most useful documents that I have read about MOOCs, which is a literature review of massive open online courses, really is a fantastic one-stop shop. Saves you from having to read all of those other documents. But it is of interest to me that they say that what marks the MOOC out from conventional online learning is that no professional academic time, or virtually none, is allocated to guiding or supporting individual learners. That's the distinguishing factor that these authors came up with. How can this be possible? There was a recent event. I specially chose a non-South African to quote here because this is so familiar to us as South Africans, but researchers and educators from other parts of the world know that access without support is not opportunity. Effective student support doesn't arise by chance. It requires intentional, structured, and proactive action that is systemic in nature and coordinated in application. And those of you who are on the Twitter sphere, and I don't think it's that many people, judging from the tweets that I've been following here lately, will have been caught up in the dramatic announcement, which was all over Twitter last week, when Sebastian Thrun, yes, there's some nodding, one of the most important people to start the whole MOOC movement, said last week after his experiences of trying to help students at a particular university, he describes what he did to try and improve their experience, and he said, I was realizing we don't educate people as others wished, or as I wished, we have a lousy product. These were students from difficult neighborhoods without good access to computers and all kinds of other challenges. It's a group for which this medium is not a good fit. This is from the mouth of the person who ran the first MOOC with 160,000 people and said, this is the answer to all our problems. We'll only have 10 universities left soon. And we're starting to get more evidence of the fact that it is, in fact, the more educated who are benefiting from MOOCs. This is a 32 courses from one university where they analyzed the general population with college degrees and the MOOC student population with college degrees. So MOOCs, some people are starting to say, are dead. And someone said to me, did you tweak your slides? Well, I had to tweak my slides when I read this article last night. Because somebody was writing, one of these, the Chronicle of Higher Education was writing that, okay, MOOCs aren't what we thought they were going to be. We all know what's the problem with MOOCs. And actually, his point was that they're usefully middlebrow. Middlebrow culture offers lists, hooks, easy handles, because real education is slow, detailed, and difficult, he says. But then he says, never mind, they're really useful for the rest of the world. Okay? So the rest of the world's really cool with the easy stuff. It was an astonishing piece. It had a lot of comments after it, as you can imagine. Right, back to Castells. Castells points out that there is a juxtaposition with two forms of flows and processes, the space of flows on the one hand and the space of places, in other words, context on the other, because people still live in places and construct their meaning and their representation in places, and they still learn in places. Of course, at the moment, globally, we know too much of what we consume is from the global north. Flickr content, online images, largely the global north. User-generated content, largely from the USA. Look how little is from Africa. Wikipedia content, largely from the USA. More than 50% is from the USA. And if you compare those Wikipedia articles with the actual population, look how poorly Africa fares. In fact, if there's one thing you take away from this talk today, it's a plea from me to please go and put content onto Wikipedia. Our students use Wikipedia. It's the #1 Google hit, and we are not actually putting content there. But those are not the only barriers to participation. Some of the barriers to participation is that we, in places like South Africa, don't have access to some of these exciting new tools. So if you want to create an iBook as an author for the iPad, you need a US tax number. And if you look at the list of Apple iBook stores, well, we're not on the list. So there's a network that we're not part of. You might think that Wikipedia is a more democratic case, but even in that space, there are contestations about whose voices get heard. And here's one example of Makmende. I don't know if there's anyone here from Kenya, but Makmende is a fictional character who's part of the local and popular culture. And so somebody wrote a Wikipedia entry, and the Wikipedia editors took it down. And the Kenyans put it back up again, and the Wikipedia editors suggested that they put it in the Swahili version of Wikipedia. So Wikipedia has a process of editors, and it has a process of notifications, and this is part of the attempt to make Wikipedia more reliable. So the notifications are references that are considered reliable references, but the references which provided this reliability were all local. And now, if you look, you can see that Makmende has been referred to in the Wall Street Journal, and the Makmende entry is now up. To go back to Coursera MOOC participation, lots of participation, but where are all the providers? I did a search on Class Central, which is a MOOC aggregator for Africa, and I found one course about African cities, which is given by a French university. What does this mean for the workshop I was in yesterday was about recontextualization. The Bernsteinians in the room will be shivering in their shoes about the levels of recontextualization that would be required with MOOC content and processes. And of course, you can call on any number of educational theorists. I chose Freire and Dewey. We know that in order for education to be most effective, content must be presented in a way that allows the student to relate the information to prior experiences. And we know that the program content must be the present existential concrete situations reflecting the aspirations of the people. This is common cause to educators. You might say, well, it's no problem, we'll adapt. In fact, we can't, because the IP conditions of MOOCs are pretty much in full copyright. Udacity is the only one who prides itself on having a Creative Commons license, but it's a non-derivative one, which means we can't adapt. We can use as is if we want to use as is, but we don't. We normally want to adapt. And in fact, and what's more scary is that except for FutureLearn, all the providers take full copyright of user-generated content. So all the examples that we as participants provide, all the case studies we provide, belong to the providers, and we sign up and we agree to that. So this is clearly a model that sees us in this part of the world and in other parts of the world as consumers, not as adapters or creators. And in a read-write web, are we talking about takers or are we talking about makers? And I have got to the end of my talk. And I'd just like to reiterate that in this ecosystem, in this room, we know a lot about good learning. And I thank my colleague for managing to enable me to say in one slide those foundational principles that we all agree about, that good learning requires mediation. We've spoken about what happens in a technological environment to mediation. We know that alignment is required. We know that engagement is required. We know that prior learning is important, essential. And we see how the new environment challenges these foundational principles. So, in short, we have to be participants in these conversations. We have to be there asserting these principles of good learning. Because the realignment of interest in the networked society enabled by new technologies is not necessarily serving the requirements of learning, the needs of disadvantaged learners, concepts of education that serve democracy and social good, or the needs of the global south. And of course, it can. I cannot leave on a negative note. And I am not a Luddite. And I am, despite what I have just said for the last period of time, not a pessimist. But it's actually up to us to engage, to ensure that these network relationships don't only serve the interests of the educated and the advantaged, and reframe global relationships of teaching and learning in that way. So I don't know what our man would have thought of an image of himself with next to technology, but to end where I began, we must be parties in the work. Thank you.